Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will make your skin crawl and your rational mind question everything. We're diving into the most bone-chilling, sleep-stealing superstitions that gripped medieval Europe like a plague of terror. These weren't just quaint folk beliefs or harmless old wives' tales. No, these were the nightmare fuel that kept entire villages awake at night, cowering behind locked doors and clutching blessed amulets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in a small medieval village. There's no electricity, no streetlights, no scientific explanation for the strange sounds echoing through the forest at night. Your world is one of flickering candles, deep shadows, and unexplained phenomena. Every creak of a wooden beam could be a demon. Every unexpected death might be the work of a witch. Every strange birth defect or crop failure could signal God's wrath or the devil's influence. Welcome to medieval Europe, where superstition wasn't just belief, it was survival. And tonight, we're exploring the most terrifying of these beliefs, the ones that shaped how people lived, how they died, and how they understood the very fabric of reality itself. Chapter 1: The Terror of the Evil Eye. Let's begin with one of the most pervasive and feared superstitions across all of medieval Europe: the evil eye. This wasn't just a casual belief, it was a genuine terror that could destroy lives, break up families, and lead to brutal accusations of witchcraft. The evil eye was the belief that certain people possessed the power to curse others simply by looking at them. Not a gentle glance or a friendly stare, but a malevolent gaze that could bring death, disease, crop failure, and misfortune with nothing more than the power of sight. Imagine living in a world where avoiding eye contact wasn't just polite, it was literally a matter of life and death. Where making the wrong person angry could result in them casting a curse on you, your children, or your livestock simply by glaring in your direction. This wasn't theoretical fear, this was daily anxiety that permeated every social interaction. The signs of being cursed by the evil eye were terrifyingly vague and all-encompassing. Did your cow stop producing milk? Evil eye. Did your child develop a fever? Evil eye. Did your crops wither for no apparent reason? Evil eye. Did you stub your toe on a rock? You guessed it, probably the evil eye. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Anyone could possess the evil eye, often without even knowing it. That friendly neighbor who complimented your baby, she might have just cursed your child. The stranger who asked for directions, he could have been sizing up your property for a curse. Even worse, some people were believed to be born with the evil eye, condemned to bring misfortune wherever they looked. Certain physical characteristics were considered telltale signs of possessing the evil eye. People with unusual eye colors, particularly those with different colored eyes, were immediately suspect. Those with deep-set eyes, prominent eyebrows, or eyes that seemed to reflect light strangely were viewed with terror and suspicion. But the real nightmare was that the evil eye was supposedly most powerful when directed at things people loved or were proud of. Compliment someone's healthy baby, and you might accidentally curse it to death. Admire someone's beautiful horse, and it might drop dead the next day. This created a culture of paranoid silence where expressing joy, pride, or admiration became dangerous. The protective measures against the evil eye were as varied as they were desperate. People wore amulets, carved symbols into their doorframes, and performed elaborate rituals to ward off cursing gazes. Iron nails were hammered into cradles to protect infants. Red ribbons were tied around the necks of livestock. Mirrors were hung in windows to reflect evil gazes back at their sources. One particularly disturbing protection ritual involved deliberately making your children appear sick, ugly, or poor, to avoid attracting the envious gaze of those with the evil eye. Parents would dress their healthy children in rags, smear dirt on their faces, or even name them with deliberately ugly names like ugly or worthless, to protect them from cursing glances. The social consequences were devastating. Communities lived in constant suspicion of one another. Friendships were destroyed by accusations of casting the evil eye. Families were torn apart when relatives were suspected of cursing each other. And those unfortunate enough to be born with the physical characteristics associated with the evil eye lived as social outcasts, feared and shunned by their own communities. What made this superstition particularly terrifying was its complete unpredictability. Unlike other medieval fears that had specific triggers or seasons, the evil eye could strike at any moment, from any direction, for any reason. There was no safe time, no safe place, no safe person. Every social interaction carried the potential for supernatural disaster. And the worst part? Once someone was believed to possess the evil eye, there was often no way to prove their innocence. The absence of evidence became evidence itself. If nothing bad happened after someone with suspected evil eye powers looked at you, it just meant they were saving their curse for later. If something bad did happen, it confirmed their guilt. This created a nightmare scenario where entire communities could be paralyzed by fear, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, and family member against family member. The evil eye wasn't just a superstition, it was a social virus that infected medieval communities with paranoia, suspicion, and terror. And here's the truly chilling part. This belief was so widespread and so deeply ingrained that it survived well into the modern era in many parts of Europe. Even today, you can find people who still believe in the power of the evil eye, still wear protective amulets, and still fear the envious gaze of their neighbors. But the evil eye was just the beginning. Medieval Europe was a buffet of supernatural terrors, each more horrifying than the last. Chapter 2. The Living Dead, Revenants and Vampires. Long before Dracula stalked through Transylvanian castles, medieval Europeans were terrified of something far more immediate and personal: the possibility that their own deceased loved ones might return from the grave as malevolent, flesh-hungry monsters. The medieval belief in revenants, the walking dead who return to torment the living, was so widespread and so deeply feared that entire communities would take drastic measures to prevent the dead from rising. And when those measures failed, the consequences were absolutely nightmarish. Revenants weren't like the zombies of modern horror fiction. These weren't mindless, shuffling corpses. No, revenants retained their intelligence, their memories, and often their ability to speak. They recognized their former friends and family members. They knew intimate details about the lives of the living. And they used this knowledge to cause maximum psychological terror. According to medieval belief, several types of people were likely to return as revenants after death. Those who died violent or sudden deaths were prime candidates. Suicides, murder victims, and those who died in accidents were all believed to have unfinished business that might draw them back from the grave. But even more terrifying was the belief that those who lived particularly sinful or evil lives would be rejected by both heaven and hell, leaving them trapped in a state of undeath. The signs of a potential revenant were carefully catalogued by medieval communities. Bodies that didn't decompose normally were immediately suspect. Corpses that remained flexible or showed signs of movement in the grave were clear warnings. Blood that remained liquid or bodies that seemed to have shifted position were evidence that the dead person was preparing to rise. But the most terrifying aspect of revenant beliefs was what happened when they actually returned. These creatures didn't just want to feed on human flesh, they wanted to psychologically torment their victims. A revenant might return to its former home and knock on the door, speaking in its old familiar voice, begging to be let in. Family members would hear their deceased loved one calling their names from outside the window, pleading for help or companionship. The physical descriptions of revenants were designed to maximize horror. They were said to retain the appearance of their former selves, but with subtle, disturbing differences. Their skin might have a grayish pallor or an unnatural coldness to the touch. Their eyes could glow with an eerie light or appear completely black. Some were described as having unnaturally long fingernails or teeth that had grown sharp and pointed. But perhaps most terrifying of all was their supernatural strength and resilience. Revenants were believed to be incredibly difficult to kill or stop. Normal weapons might slow them down but wouldn't permanently destroy them. They could break down doors, climb walls, and pursue their victims with relentless determination. The methods used to prevent revenants from rising were often more horrifying than the creatures themselves. Suspected potential revenants were sometimes decapitated before burial, with their heads placed between their legs or buried separately from their bodies. Iron spikes or wooden stakes were driven through the heart or skull. Bodies were tied with ropes or chains to prevent movement. Some communities even practiced preventive dismemberment, cutting off hands and feet before burial. When a revenant was believed to have actually risen, the methods for dealing with it were even more brutal. The corpse would be exhumed and examined for signs of supernatural preservation. If the body appeared too fresh or showed signs of movement, it would be subjected to a second, more thorough killing. This might involve decapitation, dismemberment, burning, or a combination of all three. One particularly disturbing case from medieval chronicles describes a revenant in England who returned to terrorize his village for months. The creature was said to appear at night, knocking on doors and calling out to the living by name. It would peer through windows and follow people through the streets. The community eventually exhumed the body and found it to be unnaturally preserved, with fresh blood in its mouth. They cut off its head, removed its heart, and burned both to ashes before the haunting finally stopped. The psychological impact of revenant beliefs on medieval communities cannot be overstated. Death, which should have been a final ending, became a potential new beginning of terror. Grieving families not only had to cope with the loss of their loved ones, but also with the fear that those same loved ones might return as monsters. Every sound in the night, every unexplained phenomenon, every illness or misfortune could be attributed to the malevolent actions of the restless dead. This fear was so pervasive that it influenced medieval burial practices, architecture, and even daily behavior. Cemeteries were often located far from residential areas to keep the dead at a safe distance. Heavy stones were placed on graves to prevent the buried from digging their way out. Churches were built as sanctuaries where the living could seek refuge from supernatural threats. The belief in revenants also created a thriving industry of professional exorcists, priests, and supernatural investigators who claimed to be able to identify and eliminate threats from the undead. These individuals often wielded enormous power within their communities, as they were seen as the only line of defense against supernatural threats. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of revenant beliefs was their basis in genuine medieval observations. In an era before embalming, bodies sometimes appeared to move or change position due to natural decomposition processes. Gas buildup could cause corpses to sit up or make sounds. Changes in temperature could cause bodies to bleed or appear to breathe. Medieval people, lacking scientific explanations for these phenomena, attributed them to supernatural causes. This created a vicious cycle where natural post-mortem changes were interpreted as evidence of supernatural activity, leading to increasingly elaborate and horrifying preventive measures. The more afraid people became of revenants, the more likely they were to see signs of their activity everywhere. Chapter 3. The Changeling Terror. Perhaps no medieval superstition was more devastating to families than the belief in changelings. This wasn't just a fear of supernatural creatures, it was a nightmare that could destroy the most fundamental bond between parent and child, turning love into horror and protection into persecution. The changeling belief held that evil supernatural beings, usually fairies, demons, or witches, could secretly steal human babies and replace them with their own offspring, or with enchanted objects made to look like human children. The replaced child, known as a changeling, would then slowly reveal its true supernatural nature, often driving families to madness and despair. Imagine the horror of believing that the baby you've been caring for, feeding, and loving might not actually be your child at all, but rather a supernatural impostor sent to drain your family's strength and bring misfortune into your home. This wasn't just a theoretical fear, it was a belief that led to real, documented cases of infanticide, child abuse, and family destruction throughout medieval Europe. The signs that supposedly identified a changeling were cruelly designed to encompass any child who was different, disabled, or difficult to care for. A baby who cried excessively might be a changeling. A child who failed to thrive, who seemed smaller or weaker than expected, was immediately suspect. Children with developmental disabilities, unusual physical features, or behavioral problems were all potential changelings in the eyes of their terrified communities. But the truly insidious nature of changeling beliefs was that they provided a supernatural explanation for any deviation from expected childhood development. A child who seemed too intelligent for their age might be a supernatural being with adult knowledge. A child who was unusually quiet or withdrawn could be concealing their true demonic nature. Even positive traits like unusual beauty or precocious abilities could be interpreted as signs of supernatural origin. The supposed behavior of changelings was designed to maximize parental anxiety and guilt. Changelings were said to have insatiable appetites, draining their family's resources and never appearing satisfied, no matter how much they were fed. They supposedly aged rapidly or remained unnaturally young. They might display supernatural knowledge or speak in languages they had never learned. Some were said to transform into their true supernatural forms when they thought no one was watching. The methods for detecting changelings were often more horrifying than the supposed creatures themselves. One common test involved placing the suspected changeling near a fire and watching for unnatural reactions. Another involved brewing beer in eggshells while the child watched, with the theory that a changeling would reveal its true age by commenting on never having seen such a strange practice in all its many years of existence. Even more disturbing were the methods supposedly used to force changelings to reveal their true nature or to make them return the stolen human child. These included physical abuse, starvation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and psychological torment. The logic was that while a human child might suffer or die from such treatment, a supernatural changeling would eventually abandon its disguise and flee back to its supernatural realm. The most horrifying aspect of changeling beliefs was the cure that was often attempted when a child was believed to be a changeling. Families would sometimes abandon suspected changelings in forests or at crossroads, believing that the supernatural beings who had placed them there would retrieve them and return the real child. In some cases, suspected changelings were subjected to exorcism rituals, beaten, burned, or even killed in attempts to force them to reveal their true nature. Historical records contain numerous documented cases of children being murdered by their own families due to changeling beliefs. In 1895, Bridget Cleary was killed by her husband in Ireland because he believed she had been replaced by a changeling. Similar cases occurred throughout medieval Europe, often with the perpetrators expressing genuine belief that they were trying to rescue their real loved one from supernatural kidnapping. The psychological impact of changeling beliefs on medieval families was devastating. Parents lived in constant fear that their children might not actually be their own. They scrutinized every aspect of their children's development for signs of supernatural origin. The unconditional love that should exist between parent and child was poisoned by suspicion and supernatural terror. Children themselves were not immune to the horror of changeling beliefs. Many grew up believing that they might not be truly human, that their parents might one day decide they were supernatural imposters. The fear of being identified as a changeling led many children to suppress natural behaviors, hide unusual abilities, and live in constant anxiety about their own identity. The changeling superstition was particularly cruel because it targeted the most vulnerable members of society, infants and children with disabilities or developmental differences. In an era with limited understanding of childhood development, genetics, or medical conditions, supernatural explanations filled the void left by scientific ignorance. What made changeling beliefs even more terrifying was their supposed prevalence. This wasn't a rare supernatural phenomenon, but rather a constant threat that any family might face. Stories circulated of entire villages where multiple children had been replaced by changelings. Some accounts described organized supernatural campaigns to steal human children and replace entire generations with supernatural offspring. The preventive measures against changeling theft were as varied as they were desperate. Iron objects were placed in cribs to repel supernatural beings. Bread, salt, and religious symbols were used as protective charms. Some families never left their babies unattended, believing that changelings could only be swapped when no human eyes were watching. Religious authorities often supported changeling beliefs, interpreting them through the lens of Christian theology. Changelings were seen as demonic beings sent to test human faith or punish sinful behavior. The church provided exorcism rituals and blessed objects to combat changeling threats, but also taught that such supernatural attacks might be divine punishment for moral failings. The social consequences of changeling beliefs extended beyond individual families. Communities lived in fear of supernatural infiltration. Neighbors watched each other's children for signs of changeling activity. Midwives and caregivers were sometimes accused of facilitating changeling swaps. The fear created an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned social relationships and community trust. Perhaps most tragically, changeling beliefs often prevented families from seeking appropriate care for children with legitimate medical or developmental needs. Instead of addressing real problems with real solutions, families would focus on supernatural explanations and supernatural remedies, often to the detriment of the child's health and well-being. Chapter 4. The Curse of the Unquiet Dead. Death in medieval Europe was never truly final. While we've already explored revenants, there was an even more terrifying category of supernatural threat: the unquiet dead who remain tied to the world of the living through unresolved curses, unfulfilled oaths, or unfinished business. These weren't just individual monsters returning from the grave, but rather an entire supernatural ecosystem of vengeful spirits, cursed souls, and malevolent phantoms that could terrorize communities for generations. The concept of the unquiet dead was rooted in the medieval understanding of death as a process rather than an event. The soul's journey to the afterlife could be interrupted, delayed, or prevented entirely by various supernatural circumstances. Those who died with powerful emotions like rage, hatred, or despair were believed to be particularly susceptible to becoming trapped between worlds. What made the unquiet dead so terrifying was their persistence and their intimate knowledge of the living. Unlike random supernatural threats, these spirits had personal connections to their victims. They might be deceased family members seeking revenge for perceived wrongs, former lovers cursing those who betrayed them, or murder victims demanding justice from beyond the grave. The curse of the unquiet dead could manifest in countless ways, each more horrifying than the last. Some spirits were said to appear as pale, translucent figures that would silently observe their victims, creating an atmosphere of constant, oppressive dread. Others were more aggressive, throwing objects, slamming doors, and creating violent disturbances that could drive entire families from their homes. But the most feared manifestation of unquiet dead was their ability to inflict supernatural curses that could affect multiple generations. A dying person's curse, spoken with their last breath, was believed to have enormous supernatural power. These death curses could condemn entire bloodlines to suffer misfortune, disease, or early death for decades or even centuries to come. The stories of generational curses were particularly terrifying because they suggested that the sins or mistakes of one person could doom their descendants to supernatural suffering. A medieval family might face crop failures, unexplained deaths, or persistent bad luck for years, all attributed to a curse placed by someone their ancestors had wronged decades earlier. One of the most feared types of unquiet dead was the suicide victim. In medieval Christian theology, suicide was considered one of the gravest sins, as it represented ultimate despair and rejection of God's plan. Those who took their own lives were denied burial in consecrated ground and were believed to be condemned to wander as restless spirits, unable to find peace in death. These suicide spirits were said to be particularly malevolent and unpredictable. They might appear to vulnerable individuals and attempt to convince them to join in eternal damnation through self-destruction. They could possess the living, driving them to madness and despair. Some were believed to have the power to create suicide clusters by supernaturally influencing multiple people in a community to take their own lives. The preventive measures against the unquiet dead often involved elaborate funeral rituals designed to ensure the deceased's peaceful transition to the afterlife. Bodies were positioned in specific ways, buried with particular objects, and subjected to religious ceremonies intended to sever their connections to the world of the living. Iron nails might be driven through the coffin to pin the corpse in place. Religious symbols were carved into headstones to provide divine protection. But when preventive measures failed and the unquiet dead began to manifest, the remedies were often more terrifying than the original supernatural threat. Suspected haunted houses were sometimes burned to the ground with all their contents. Graves were exhumed, and the bodies subjected to additional killing procedures, including decapitation, dismemberment, or burning. In extreme cases, entire families or communities might be forced to relocate to escape persistent supernatural harassment. The psychological impact of believing in the unquiet dead was profound and lasting. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that death was not an ending, but potentially a new beginning of supernatural terror. Every funeral became a potential source of future haunting. Every conflict with neighbors or family members carried the risk of creating a lifelong supernatural enemy. This fear influenced medieval behavior in countless ways. People were reluctant to wrong others, knowing that the victim's death curse could pursue them and their descendants for generations. Deathbed scenes became fraught with supernatural anxiety, as families desperately tried to ensure their dying loved ones passed away in a state of spiritual peace rather than anger or despair. The concept of the unquiet dead also created opportunities for supernatural blackmail and social control. Dying individuals could threaten to curse their enemies or even their own families if their final wishes were not respected. Communities might ostracize or appease individuals who were believed to have the power to return as vengeful spirits after death. What made these beliefs particularly horrifying was their complete unpredictability. While other supernatural threats might have specific triggers or protective measures, the unquiet dead could emerge from any death at any time for any reason. A person who seemed to die peacefully might return months or years later as a vengeful spirit. A minor slight against a dying person could result in generations of supernatural persecution. The intersection of the unquiet dead with medieval legal and social systems created additional layers of terror. Crimes that went unpunished in life were believed to demand supernatural justice after death. Murder victims who had been denied earthly justice would return to identify their killers and demand revenge. This created a parallel supernatural legal system where the dead could continue to prosecute their cases long after earthly courts had closed. Religious authorities struggled with the concept of the unquiet dead, as it challenged official church teachings about death and the afterlife. While the church taught that souls went directly to heaven, hell, or purgatory after death, popular belief insisted that some spirits remain trapped in the earthly realm. This theological tension created confusion and fear, as people weren't sure whether to trust official religious doctrine or their own supernatural experiences. Chapter 5: The Devil's Harvest, Demonic Possession, and Witchcraft. In the shadowy corners of medieval Europe, where candlelight flickered against stone walls and shadows danced with menacing life, lurked perhaps the most terrifying supernatural threat of all: the devil himself and his army of demons, witches, and corrupted souls. This wasn't just about individual evil, but rather a cosmic war between good and evil being fought in every village, every home, and every human heart. The medieval mind understood demonic possession not as a psychological condition, but as a literal invasion of the human body and soul by supernatural evil. Demons were believed to be fallen angels, intelligent and malevolent beings with the power to enter human bodies, control human behavior, and use possessed individuals as weapons against the innocent. The signs of demonic possession were terrifyingly diverse and could manifest in ways that encompassed almost any unusual behavior. Sudden personality changes, speaking in unknown languages, displaying supernatural strength, or demonstrating knowledge of hidden information were all considered evidence of demonic influence. But even more mundane symptoms like persistent illness, depression, or antisocial behavior could be interpreted as signs of supernatural corruption. What made possession particularly horrifying was the belief that demons specifically targeted the innocent and the faithful. Children were considered especially vulnerable, as their pure souls were seen as valuable prizes for demonic corruption. Nuns and priests were frequent targets, as their fall from grace would represent a significant victory for the forces of evil. Even ordinary villagers could find themselves accused of possession if they displayed any behavior that deviated from community norms. The process of possession was believed to be gradual and insidious. Demons didn't simply appear and take control of their victims overnight. Instead, they were thought to work slowly, beginning with minor temptations and gradually increasing their influence until they achieved complete domination. This meant that any small moral failing or unusual behavior could be interpreted as the first stage of demonic corruption. The possessed person was believed to become a vessel for supernatural evil, capable of performing acts far beyond normal human abilities. Possessed individuals might display incredible physical strength, allowing them to break chains or overpower multiple attackers. They could speak in languages they had never learned, revealing intimate secrets about people they had never met. Some were said to levitate, transform their appearance, or perform other impossible feats. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the belief that possessed individuals retained awareness of their condition while being powerless to control their actions. They were trapped inside their own bodies, forced to watch as demons used them to commit horrible acts against their friends and family members. This created a double horror, as the possessed person suffered both the physical effects of demonic control and the psychological trauma of being forced to participate in their own corruption. The methods used to identify and treat demonic possession were often more brutal than the supposed possession itself. Suspected possessed individuals were subjected to painful exorcism rituals that could last for days or weeks. These procedures involved forced fasting, sleep deprivation, physical restraint, and exposure to religious symbols and prayers. The logic was that while a human body might suffer from such treatment, a demon would be forced to reveal itself and flee when confronted with divine power. Holy water was thrown on suspected possessed individuals to see if it would burn their skin. Crucifixes were pressed against their flesh to test for supernatural reaction. Religious relics were forced into their mouths or held against their bodies. If the person showed any sign of distress or pain during these procedures, it was interpreted as evidence that demons were being driven from their body. The social consequences of possession accusations were devastating. Once someone was believed to be possessed, they became a pariah within their community. Family members might abandon them out of fear of demonic contamination. Friends would shun them to avoid being targeted by the demons that controlled them. Even if the possession was supposedly cured, the stigma could last for years, or even a lifetime. The connection between demonic possession and witchcraft created an even more terrifying supernatural landscape. Witches were believed to be humans who had voluntarily made pacts with demons, trading their souls for supernatural power. Unlike possessed individuals who were seen as victims, witches were viewed as willing collaborators with evil, who actively sought to harm their neighbors and corrupt the innocent. The fear of witchcraft was so pervasive in medieval Europe that it led to one of the most horrifying chapters in human history, the witch trials. Entire communities could be consumed by witch hysteria, as accusations spread like wildfire and neighbors turned against neighbors in an orgy of supernatural paranoia and violence. The supposed powers of witches were vast and terrifying. They could curse crops, causing famines that would starve entire villages. They could cause diseases in humans and animals, spreading plague and death through supernatural means. They could control the weather, bringing droughts, floods, or devastating storms. They could influence human behavior, causing people to fall in love, become violent, or make poor decisions. But perhaps most feared of all was the witch's supposed ability to steal and corrupt souls. Witches were believed to target unbaptized infants, whose souls were particularly vulnerable to demonic influence. They could curse unborn children while still in the womb, ensuring they would be born as monsters or die in infancy. They could even steal the souls of adults, condemning them to eternal damnation while using their bodies as vessels for demonic power. The methods used to identify witches were designed to ensure that almost anyone could be accused and convicted. Physical abnormalities like birthmarks, moles, or unusual growths were interpreted as devil's marks, where demons had touched their human servants. The ability to float when thrown into water was seen as evidence of supernatural power, while sinking and drowning was proof of innocence. Any knowledge of herbal medicine or folk remedies could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural abilities. The torture used to extract confessions from suspected witches was so severe that most victims would eventually admit to anything their interrogators suggested. They confessed to flying through the air on broomsticks, attending Sabbaths where they worshiped the devil, and performing impossible feats of magic. These forced confessions were then used as evidence to justify even more accusations and arrests, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of supernatural terror. The witch hunts created a climate of paranoia and suspicion that poisoned medieval communities. Neighbors watched each other for signs of supernatural activity. Children were taught to fear and report unusual behavior in their own family members. Healers, midwives, and herbalists found themselves particularly vulnerable to accusations, as their knowledge of natural remedies could be reinterpreted as evidence of demonic pacts. What made the fear of witchcraft particularly insidious was its intersection with medieval social tensions. Accusations often fell disproportionately on women, especially older women who lived alone or who challenged social norms in some way. The poor, the disabled, and social outcasts were also frequent targets. The witch trials became a way to eliminate undesirable individuals, while claiming to protect the community from supernatural threats. The psychological impact of living in a world where demons and witches were believed to be constantly active cannot be overstated. Medieval people lived in constant fear of supernatural attack. Every illness, every accident, every piece of bad luck could be attributed to demonic influence or witchcraft. prayer and religious observance became not just spiritual practices, but essential defensive measures against supernatural warfare. Chapter 6. The Wild Hunt and Spectral Armies. As winter winds howled across medieval Europe and darkness fell early over snow-covered landscapes, terrified villagers would bar their doors and windows against more than just the cold. They feared the wild hunt, a supernatural phenomenon so terrifying that it could drive witnesses insane and snatch souls from the living world to join an eternal procession of the damned. The wild hunt was not a single legend, but rather a collection of similar supernatural beliefs that spread across northern and central Europe. At its core was the terrifying concept of a ghostly army that rode through the sky during the darkest months of the year, led by a supernatural huntsman and accompanied by spectral hounds, fallen warriors, and the souls of the damned. The appearance of the wild hunt was heralded by signs that struck fear into the hearts of all who witnessed them. The sound of hunting horns echoing across empty landscapes announced their approach. The baying of enormous supernatural hounds could be heard from miles away, growing louder and more threatening as the spectral army drew near. The very air seemed to thicken with dread, and animals would flee in panic or cower in terror. But the true horror came when the hunt itself appeared in the sky above. Witnesses described a terrifying procession of ghostly riders mounted on supernatural steeds, their eyes glowing like coals and their bodies translucent as mist. The horses themselves were often described as enormous, black creatures with glowing red eyes and breath that steamed like fire. Some accounts describe the horses as having no skin, revealing their bones and sinews as they galloped through the air. The leader of the wild hunt varied depending on the local tradition, but was always a figure of immense supernatural power and terror. In some regions, it was believed to be a fallen king or nobleman, condemned to lead the hunt as punishment for crimes committed in life. In Germanic traditions, the leader was sometimes identified as Woden or Odin, the ancient god of war and death. Christian interpretations often portrayed the leader as a damned soul, or even as the devil himself, leading an army of the damned through the earthly realm. The spectral hounds that accompanied the hunt were perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire phenomenon. These weren't ordinary dogs, but supernatural beasts of enormous size, with glowing eyes, razor-sharp fangs, and an insatiable hunger for human souls. Their howling was said to be so loud and so filled with supernatural dread that it could be heard for miles, causing listeners to fall to their knees in terror. The riders of the wild hunt were composed of various types of damned souls and supernatural beings. Fallen warriors who had died in battle might find themselves conscripted into the eternal army. Those who had committed terrible sins in life could be condemned to ride with the hunt as punishment. In some traditions, the hunt was said to collect the souls of those who died violent deaths, forcing them to join the spectral procession whether they wanted to or not. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the hunt's interaction with the living. Those unfortunate enough to encounter the wild hunt faced several possible fates, none of them pleasant. Witnesses might be driven permanently insane by the sight of the spectral army. Others could be physically swept up by the hunt and forced to join their eternal ride through the skies. Some accounts describe people being torn apart by the spectral hounds or trampled by the ghostly horses. The timing of the wild hunt was particularly significant and added to its supernatural terror. The hunt was most active during the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany, a period known as the Rauhnächte or rough nights in Germanic tradition. This was a time when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was believed to be at its thinnest, allowing supernatural forces to cross into the earthly realm. The hunt was also associated with storms, particularly winter thunderstorms that were rare and therefore especially ominous. The sound of thunder was interpreted as the hoofbeats of the spectral horses, while lightning was seen as the flashing of supernatural weapons. The howling of winter winds was believed to be the baying of the spectral hounds, searching for souls to claim for their eternal pack. The protective measures against the wild hunt were desperate and often futile. People would hide in their homes during the dangerous months, refusing to venture outside after dark. All doors and windows were barred and blessed with holy water. Religious symbols were hung in prominent places, and prayers were recited throughout the night. Some traditions held that iron objects could provide protection, leading people to sleep with iron tools or weapons nearby. But even these precautions were not guaranteed to work. The wild hunt was said to be capable of entering any dwelling it chose, passing through walls and barriers as if they didn't exist. The only real protection was to avoid attracting the hunt's attention in the first place, which meant maintaining absolute silence and darkness during the dangerous nights. Those who were brave or foolish enough to peek outside during the wild hunt's passage risked immediate and terrible consequences. Simply witnessing the spectral procession could result in madness, blindness, or death. Some accounts describe people being instantly aged decades by the sight, their hair turning white and their bodies withering as if they had lived through years of horror in a single moment. The psychological impact of the wild hunt on medieval communities was profound and lasting. Entire villages would essentially shut down during the dangerous winter months, with all normal activity ceasing after sunset. Travel was avoided whenever possible, and those who absolutely had to venture outside during the dark months did so only during daylight hours and only when absolutely necessary. The wild hunt also served as a supernatural explanation for winter deaths and disappearances. When someone went missing during the dangerous months, it was often assumed that they had been claimed by the spectral army. Bodies found in impossible locations, such as high in trees or on rooftops, were believed to have been dropped by the hunt after being swept up in their aerial procession. What made the wild hunt particularly terrifying was its apparent randomness. Unlike other supernatural threats that might have specific triggers or could be avoided through particular behaviors, the wild hunt struck without warning and without regard for the moral character of its victims. Saints and sinners alike could be swept up in its path. The wealthy and the poor, the young and the old, all were equally vulnerable to its supernatural predations. Chapter 7. The Curse of the Black Death and Supernatural Plague. In 1347, something far worse than any ghost, demon, or witch descended upon medieval Europe. The Black Death arrived not as a single terrifying entity, but as an invisible, unstoppable force that would kill 1/3 of the continent's population and shatter every assumption about divine protection, earthly safety, and supernatural causation. But to medieval minds, the plague was not simply a disease. It was a supernatural catastrophe of biblical proportions, a divine punishment that confirmed their worst fears about the fragility of human existence and the constant presence of supernatural forces in their daily lives. The Black Death became the ultimate validation of every terrifying superstition they had ever believed. The arrival of the plague was preceded by ominous supernatural signs that filled medieval chroniclers with apocalyptic dread. Witnesses reported strange lights in the sky, unusual behavior in animals, and a sense of supernatural oppression that seemed to blanket entire regions. Earthquakes, floods, and other natural disasters were interpreted as warnings of the coming supernatural catastrophe. When the plague finally arrived, its symptoms seemed to confirm the supernatural interpretation. Victims developed enormous, painful swellings called buboes that could grow to the size of apples. Their skin turned black in patches, giving the disease its terrifying name. They suffered from high fevers, delirium, and often died within days or even hours of showing the first symptoms. But what made the plague truly terrifying to medieval minds was its apparent supernatural intelligence. The disease seemed to choose its victims according to no earthly logic. It could strike down the young and healthy, while sparing the old and infirm. It could devastate one household while leaving their neighbors completely untouched. It could appear suddenly in isolated communities that had no contact with infected areas. The medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally supernatural. Illness was believed to be caused by divine punishment, demonic influence, or supernatural curses rather than by natural causes. The Black Death, with its unprecedented scale and seemingly random patterns of destruction, appeared to confirm these beliefs in the most terrifying way possible. Religious authorities initially interpreted the plague as divine punishment for human sinfulness. Entire communities engaged in desperate acts of penance, hoping to appease God's wrath and halt the supernatural catastrophe. Processions of flagellants traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves bloody in hopes that their suffering would satisfy divine justice and end the plague. But as the death toll mounted and the plague continued to spread despite all religious efforts, a more sinister supernatural explanation began to take hold. If the plague was not divine punishment, then perhaps it was the work of demons, witches, or other supernatural enemies. This shift in interpretation led to some of the most horrifying chapters in medieval history. The search for supernatural scapegoats led to massive persecutions of anyone who could be blamed for causing the plague through supernatural means. Jewish communities were particularly targeted, accused of poisoning wells or casting spells to spread the disease. Entire Jewish populations were murdered in pogroms that swept across Europe, with thousands burned alive or killed in other horrific ways. Women, especially older women or those with knowledge of herbal medicine, were accused of being witches who had caused the plague through demonic pacts. Beggars, foreigners, and anyone who seemed different or suspicious became potential targets for supernatural blame. The plague created a climate of paranoia and violence where anyone could be accused of supernatural terrorism. The supposed methods by which these supernatural enemies spread the plague were as varied as they were terrifying. They were accused of poisoning water supplies with magical potions. They allegedly cast spells that could spread disease through the air. Some were believed to have the power to kill with a glance, combining the ancient fear of the evil eye with the immediate terror of plague transmission. The protective measures against supernatural plague were desperate and often contradictory. Religious objects were worn as amulets to ward off supernatural disease. Prayers were recited constantly to maintain divine protection. Some communities created elaborate ritual barriers around their towns, believing that supernatural diseases could be prevented from entering through magical means. Ironically, some of the supernatural protective measures accidentally provided real protection against the disease. The practice of avoiding contact with strangers, which was motivated by fear of supernatural contamination, actually reduced exposure to infected individuals. Some religious practices that emphasized cleanliness had similar unintended benefits. But many supernatural remedies were actively harmful. The persecution of Jewish communities eliminated some of the few people who had knowledge of effective medical practices. The focus on supernatural causation prevented the development of practical measures that might have reduced transmission. The climate of fear and paranoia actually made the social effects of the plague worse. The psychological impact of the Black Death on medieval supernatural beliefs was profound and lasting. The plague seemed to confirm that the world was indeed a supernatural battleground where invisible forces could strike without warning and destroy entire civilizations. It validated the medieval worldview that saw supernatural threats lurking behind every misfortune and catastrophe. The plague also created a feedback loop of supernatural terror. As communities became more afraid of supernatural causes, they became more likely to see supernatural explanations for any unusual event. This led to increased persecution of supposed supernatural enemies, which in turn created more social chaos and made recovery from the plague more difficult. The long-term effects of the Black Death on European supernatural beliefs were enormous. The plague experience reinforced fears of invisible supernatural threats that could strike without warning. It validated beliefs about the power of curses, the reality of supernatural warfare, and the constant presence of evil forces in the world. Even after the immediate plague crisis passed, European communities remained hypersensitive to supernatural threats. Subsequent disease outbreaks, even minor ones, could trigger massive supernatural panics. The association between disease and supernatural causation became even stronger, leading to centuries of continued persecution of supposed witches, poisoners, and supernatural terrorists. The Black Death had proven that medieval Europe's worst supernatural fears were not just possible but actual. If invisible forces could kill 1/3 of the population, then clearly any supernatural threat, no matter how terrifying, might be real. Chapter 8. Lycanthropy, the Beast Within. Deep in the dark forests of medieval Europe, where moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy and wolves howled their ancient songs, lurked a terror that combined humanity's fear of wild beasts with their horror of supernatural transformation. Lycanthropy, the belief that humans could transform into wolves, represented one of the most visceral and terrifying superstitions of the medieval world. Unlike many supernatural fears that remained safely theoretical, lycanthropy seemed to offer tangible evidence of its reality. Wolves were a genuine threat to medieval communities, killing livestock and occasionally attacking humans. When these natural wolf attacks were combined with the mysterious disappearances of people and unexplained violent crimes, it created a perfect storm of supernatural terror. The medieval understanding of lycanthropy was not simply about physical transformation, but about the complete corruption of the human soul. Werewolves were not seen as victims of supernatural affliction, but as individuals who had voluntarily abandoned their humanity through demonic pacts, cannibalism, or other acts of ultimate evil. They represented the terrifying possibility that the person sitting next to you at church might literally be a monster in disguise. The process of becoming a werewolf was believed to involve deliberate choices that placed the individual beyond redemption. Some accounts described rituals where potential werewolves would remove all their clothing and rub their bodies with magical ointments made from human fat, herbs, and other supernatural ingredients. Others involved wearing belts made from wolf skin or human skin, which would trigger the transformation when put on. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the accounts of lycanthropy caused by cannibalism. Medieval belief held that humans who ate human flesh would gradually lose their humanity and transform into beasts. This created a horrifying cycle where werewolves would kill and eat their victims, creating more werewolves in the process and threatening to turn entire communities into supernatural monsters. The physical descriptions of werewolves were designed to maximize terror and make identification nearly impossible. In human form, lycanthropes were said to display subtle signs of their true nature: unusual body hair, sharp or prominent teeth, long fingernails, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. But these signs were often so subtle that they could be missed or misinterpreted, meaning that anyone could potentially be a werewolf in disguise. The transformation process itself was described in horrifyingly vivid detail. The human would convulse in pain as their bones stretched and reformed. Their skin would sprout coarse hair, while their face elongated into a wolf-like snout. Their teeth would grow into fangs, while their fingernails became claws. The transformation was said to be extremely painful, but also addictive, with lycanthropes eventually preferring their beast form to their human appearance. In wolf form, lycanthropes retained their human intelligence while gaining the physical capabilities of a supernatural predator. They were faster and stronger than normal wolves, with enhanced senses and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Unlike natural wolves, which generally avoided human contact, werewolves actively sought out human victims, particularly targeting children and isolated individuals. The supposed behavior of werewolves combined the worst aspects of human malevolence with animal savagery. They would stalk their victims for days or weeks, learning their routines and identifying moments of vulnerability. They could plan complex attacks, set traps, and even coordinate with other werewolves in pack-like behavior that was far more sophisticated than natural wolf hunting. What made lycanthropy particularly terrifying was the belief that werewolves retained enough of their human nature to take pleasure in causing fear and suffering. They didn't simply kill for food, but seemed to enjoy the terror they inspired in their communities. Some accounts described werewolves leaving partially eaten bodies in places where they would be discovered, apparently taking sadistic pleasure in the horror they caused. The methods for identifying werewolves were notoriously unreliable and often led to tragic false accusations. Physical abnormalities, like excessive body hair, prominent teeth, or unusual gait patterns, were all considered suspicious. Behavioral signs included avoiding silver or religious objects, preferring raw meat, or displaying unusual knowledge of wolf behavior. But the most insidious aspect of werewolf identification was the belief that lycanthropes could only be detected when they were actually transforming or in their wolf form. This meant that suspected werewolves might be watched for months or years, with observers waiting for them to reveal their true nature. The paranoia and suspicion this created could tear communities apart. The protective measures against werewolves were as varied as they were desperate. Silver was believed to be particularly effective, leading people to wear silver jewelry or carry silver weapons. Wolf's bane and other herbs were hung in doorways or worn as amulets. Religious symbols and blessed objects were thought to repel lycanthropes, much like other supernatural threats. But unlike many supernatural creatures, werewolves were believed to be vulnerable to physical violence, making them a threat that could potentially be fought rather than simply endured. This led to the formation of hunting parties armed with silver weapons, blessed ammunition, and specialized knowledge of werewolf behavior. The hunt for werewolves often became more terrifying than the supposed creatures themselves. Suspected lycanthropes were subjected to torture to force them to confess their supernatural nature. They were tested with silver objects, exposed to religious symbols, and forced to eat blessed bread to see if these substances would cause supernatural reactions. When werewolves were supposedly captured, the methods used to contain or kill them were brutally practical. Since they were believed to retain their supernatural nature even in human form, normal execution methods were often deemed insufficient. Suspected werewolves might be burned alive, dismembered, or killed with silver weapons to ensure their permanent destruction. The social impact of lycanthropy beliefs was devastating to medieval communities. Neighbors lived in fear that their friends and family members might be supernatural monsters. Children were taught to fear strange adults and to report any unusual behavior they observed. The natural wariness that humans felt toward wolves was amplified into a paralyzing terror of supernatural predators that could be anywhere, at any time. The intersection of lycanthropy beliefs with medieval legal systems created additional complications. How do you prosecute someone for being a supernatural monster? How do you determine guilt when the evidence consists mainly of supernatural transformations that only occur under specific conditions? These questions led to legal procedures that were often more horrifying than the supposed crimes themselves. What made lycanthropy particularly insidious was its connection to real criminal behavior. Some individuals who committed violent crimes claimed to be werewolves, either as a defense strategy or due to genuine psychological delusion. This created a feedback loop where lycanthropy beliefs were reinforced by actual criminal confessions, making the supernatural threat seem even more real and immediate. The psychological impact of living in fear of lycanthropes cannot be overstated. Medieval people lived with the constant awareness that the person next to them might literally be a monster in disguise. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every unexplained noise in the night might herald a supernatural attack, and every missing person might have fallen victim to lycanthropic predation. Chapter 9. The Mirror of the Soul and Supernatural Reflection. In the flickering candlelight of medieval chambers, where shadows danced with malevolent life and reality seemed to waver like heat over summer stones, mirrors held a special place in the hierarchy of supernatural terror. These polished surfaces of metal or rare glass were not simply tools for vanity, but windows into the supernatural realm, portals that could reveal hidden truths, trap souls, and unleash forces beyond human comprehension. The medieval understanding of reflection was fundamentally supernatural. Mirrors were believed to capture not just the physical appearance of their subjects, but their very souls. This made them incredibly dangerous objects that could be used for supernatural surveillance, soul theft, and communication with otherworldly entities. The act of looking into a mirror was not a simple observation, but a spiritual encounter fraught with supernatural peril. The most terrifying aspect of mirror superstitions was the belief that they could reveal the true nature of supernatural beings. Vampires, demons, and other evil entities supposedly cast no reflection, making mirrors a potential tool for identifying supernatural threats. But this protective capability came with enormous risks, as the act of using a mirror to detect supernatural beings could attract their attention and invite supernatural retaliation. The concept of soul capture through mirrors was particularly horrifying, because it suggested that the simple act of looking at one's reflection could result in spiritual imprisonment. Medieval belief held that mirrors could trap souls within their reflective surfaces, leaving the physical body alive but spiritually empty. These trapped souls were said to be visible to those with supernatural sight, appearing as shadows or distortions within the mirror's surface. The process of soul trapping was believed to be gradual and insidious. Spending too much time gazing into mirrors, particularly with vanity or narcissistic intent, could slowly weaken the connection between soul and body. Eventually, the soul might become permanently trapped in the mirror, condemned to exist as a reflection, while the body became a hollow shell vulnerable to possession by demons or other malevolent entities. But mirrors could also serve as supernatural communication devices, allowing contact with spirits, demons, and other otherworldly beings. Certain rituals involving mirrors were said to open doorways to the realm of the dead, permitting communication with deceased relatives or supernatural entities. These practices were considered extremely dangerous, as they could allow malevolent beings to enter the physical world through the mirror's surface. The phenomenon of supernatural scrying, or divination through mirrors, was both feared and sought after in medieval Europe. Practitioners claimed to be able to see future events, distant locations, or hidden truths by gazing into specially prepared mirrors under specific conditions. But these supernatural visions came with terrible risks, as the scryer might see things that were not meant for human eyes, or attract the attention of entities that preferred to remain hidden. One particularly terrifying mirror superstition involved the appearance of doppelgangers, or spiritual doubles, in reflective surfaces. These supernatural duplicates were believed to be evil twins or demonic copies that could appear in mirrors instead of the viewer's true reflection. The appearance of a doppelganger was considered an omen of imminent death, as it suggested that supernatural forces were already preparing to claim the viewer's soul. The timing of mirror encounters was crucial to their supernatural significance. Mirrors were considered most dangerous during certain times of day or year, when the boundary between the physical and supernatural worlds was thinnest. Midnight, the witching hour, was particularly perilous for mirror gazing. The period between Christmas and Epiphany, when supernatural activity was believed to be at its peak, made any interaction with mirrors extremely hazardous. The superstitions surrounding broken mirrors were among the most persistent and widely believed. A shattered mirror was thought to release any trapped souls or supernatural entities that had been confined within its surface. But, more terrifyingly, breaking a mirror was believed to fragment the soul of the person who had last looked into it, condemning them to 7 years of supernatural misfortune as their spiritual essence slowly reassembled itself. The protective measures against mirror-based supernatural threats were complex and often contradictory. Some traditions held that covering mirrors with cloth could prevent supernatural entities from using them as portals. Others believed that certain symbols or prayers carved into mirror frames could provide protection. Holy water sprinkled on mirror surfaces was thought to prevent supernatural manifestations. But the most extreme protective measure was the complete avoidance of mirrors, particularly by those who were already vulnerable to supernatural attack. Suspected witches, possessed individuals, and those suffering from supernatural curses were often forbidden from looking into mirrors, as it was believed that their compromised spiritual state made them particularly susceptible to mirror-based supernatural threats. The intersection of mirror superstitions with medieval vanity and beauty practices created additional layers of supernatural anxiety. The act of admiring one's appearance in a mirror was considered potentially sinful, as it demonstrated pride and narcissism. But more terrifyingly, it was believed that excessive mirror gazing could attract the attention of demons who specialized in corrupting human souls through vanity and self-obsession. Women were considered particularly vulnerable to mirror-based supernatural threats because of their supposed natural tendency toward vanity. Young women who spent too much time admiring their reflections were warned that they might attract supernatural suitors, including demons or evil spirits, who would court them through their mirror images. These supernatural relationships could result in possession, corruption, or even supernatural pregnancy. The belief in supernatural mirror doubles led to elaborate rituals designed to determine whether a reflection was genuine or supernatural. These might involve making specific gestures or speaking particular words while watching the mirror image to see if it responded correctly. A delayed response, reversed movement, or failure to mouth the correct words was evidence that a supernatural entity was masquerading as the viewer's reflection. The psychological impact of mirror superstitions on medieval people was profound and lasting. Many individuals developed a lifelong fear of their own reflections, avoiding mirrors whenever possible or approaching them only when absolutely necessary. The simple act of grooming or checking one's appearance became fraught with supernatural anxiety. The social consequences of mirror beliefs extended beyond individual fear to influence medieval architecture and interior design. Mirrors were often placed in specific locations within homes and public buildings to maximize their protective benefits while minimizing their supernatural risks. The positioning of mirrors relative to windows, doors, and religious symbols was carefully considered to prevent supernatural entities from using them as entry points. Religious authorities struggled with mirror superstitions as they seemed to conflict with official church teachings while being too widely believed to dismiss entirely. Some clergy embraced mirror symbolism, interpreting mirrors as representations of divine truth that revealed the spiritual state of those who gazed into them. Others condemned mirror-based practices as forms of divination or supernatural communication that violated Christian doctrine. The legacy of medieval mirror superstitions extended far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing folklore, literature, and popular culture for centuries to come. The image of the supernatural mirror that reveals hidden truths or traps souls became an enduring element of horror and fantasy, suggesting that these ancient fears tapped into something fundamental about human psychology and our relationship with our own reflection. Chapter 10: The Curse of Iron and the Supernatural Forge. In the heart of every medieval village, where the hammer's rhythmic pounding echoed through narrow streets and sparks flew like fallen stars, stood the blacksmith's forge. But this was far more than a simple workplace where metal was shaped into tools and weapons. The forge was a supernatural nexus where the primal elements of fire and iron collided, creating not just physical objects but also spiritual forces that could protect against evil or unleash it upon the world. Iron itself was believed to possess inherent supernatural properties that made it both a powerful protective charm and a potentially dangerous substance that required careful handling. Unlike other metals, iron was thought to be spiritually pure, blessed by divine forces and naturally hostile to demons, fairies, and other supernatural entities. But this same spiritual potency made iron dangerous to work with, as the process of forging could either enhance its protective properties or corrupt them into supernatural weapons. The medieval blacksmith occupied a unique and somewhat feared position within the community's supernatural landscape. They were seen as individuals who had mastered the dangerous art of controlling supernatural forces through their manipulation of iron and fire. This gave them enormous respect and influence, but also made them objects of suspicion and fear. A blacksmith's skill was not just technical but spiritual, and a corrupt or evil blacksmith could potentially forge weapons of supernatural malevolence. The process of forging iron was believed to be inherently supernatural, involving the transformation of raw metal through the sacred element of fire. The forge fire itself was considered a living entity that required careful tending and proper spiritual preparation. A forge fire that burned incorrectly could produce cursed iron that would bring misfortune to anyone who used it. Conversely, a properly blessed forge fire could create iron objects with powerful protective properties. The timing of ironworking was crucial to its supernatural effects. Iron forged during certain phases of the moon, on specific holy days, or during particular seasons was believed to possess enhanced protective properties. Christmas Eve was considered an especially powerful time for forging protective iron, as the spiritual significance of Christ's birth was thought to imbue the metal with divine protection. But iron forging could also be corrupted by evil influences, creating objects of supernatural malevolence. A blacksmith who worked while angry, drunk, or spiritually unclean was believed to transfer these negative qualities into the iron he forged. Iron worked during unholy times, such as during eclipses or on days associated with demonic activity, was thought to be cursed and dangerous to use. The supernatural properties of iron extended far beyond simple protective charms. Iron horseshoes were among the most powerful protective objects in medieval Europe, believed to ward off witches, demons, and evil spirits when properly hung over doorways. The crescent shape of the horseshoe was thought to trap evil spirits, while the iron itself repelled supernatural entities. Iron nails driven into specific locations were believed to provide protection against supernatural threats. Nails hammered into the thresholds of homes could prevent demons and witches from entering. Iron nails driven into coffins were thought to prevent the dead from rising as revenants or vampires. Some particularly powerful protective rituals involved driving iron nails into crossroads, creating barriers that supernatural entities could not cross. The supernatural properties of iron made it the preferred material for weapons designed to fight supernatural enemies. Iron swords were believed to be capable of permanently destroying demons, cutting through supernatural illusions, and harming entities that were immune to conventional weapons. Iron arrowheads could allegedly pierce supernatural armor and wound beings that were otherwise invulnerable to physical attack. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the belief that iron could be corrupted to create supernatural weapons of evil. Cursed iron swords were said to hunger for blood, compelling their wielders to commit acts of violence and murder. Iron objects forged with malevolent intent could supposedly cause supernatural misfortune to their owners, bringing disease, madness, or death to anyone who touched them. The process of detecting cursed or supernatural iron was itself fraught with supernatural danger. Iron objects suspected of being cursed might be tested with holy water, blessed salt, or religious symbols to see if they produced supernatural reactions. Objects that grew unusually hot or cold when touched, that caused pain to those who handled them, or that seemed to resist normal use, were all considered potentially supernatural. The blacksmith's tools themselves were believed to possess supernatural significance. The hammer used to shape iron was thought to contain spiritual power accumulated through years of sacred work. The anvil upon which iron was shaped was considered a supernatural altar where the transformation of metal took place. These tools were often blessed by priests and protected with religious symbols to ensure their spiritual purity. The supernatural aspects of iron working extended to the raw materials used in the forge. Iron ore taken from certain locations was believed to possess enhanced spiritual properties. Metal recovered from lightning strikes was considered especially powerful, as it had been touched by divine fire. Iron salvaged from ancient battlefields was thought to retain the spiritual energy of the warriors who had died there. The water used to quench hot iron during the forging process was also believed to possess supernatural significance. Water that had been blessed, taken from sacred springs, or collected during certain weather conditions, was thought to enhance the protective properties of the iron. Conversely, water that had been corrupted or cursed could contaminate the iron and create objects of supernatural malevolence. The smoke and sparks produced during iron working were interpreted as supernatural signs that could reveal information about the spiritual state of the work being performed. Smoke that rose straight up was considered a good omen, while smoke that swirled or moved in unusual patterns might indicate supernatural interference. Sparks that flew in particular directions could be interpreted as omens about the future effectiveness of the iron being forged. The apprenticeship of blacksmiths included not just technical training, but also spiritual education about the supernatural aspects of iron working. Young apprentices were taught to recognize the signs of cursed iron, to perform protective rituals before beginning work, and to identify supernatural interference in the forging process. This knowledge was considered as important as the technical skills of metalworking. The social position of blacksmiths in medieval communities was complicated by their association with supernatural forces. While they were respected for their essential skills and their ability to create protective iron objects, they were also feared as individuals who wielded dangerous supernatural powers. A blacksmith who fell from grace or turned to evil was considered an especially dangerous enemy, capable of forging cursed weapons and protective objects. The intersection of iron superstitions with medieval warfare created additional layers of supernatural belief. Weapons and armor were not just evaluated for their physical effectiveness, but also for their spiritual properties. A sword forged by a skilled and virtuous blacksmith was believed to provide supernatural protection to its wielder, while a weapon created by an evil blacksmith might betray its user at a crucial moment. The maintenance and care of iron objects was also surrounded by supernatural beliefs. Iron tools and weapons required not just physical maintenance, but also spiritual cleansing to maintain their protective properties. This might involve blessing the objects with holy water, exposing them to sacred fires, or performing purification rituals to remove any supernatural contamination. Chapter 11. The Supernatural Marketplace, Cursed Objects and Haunted Goods. In the bustling medieval marketplace, where merchants hawked their wares beneath colorful banners and buyers bargained with voices raised in commercial competition, lurked a supernatural terror that could turn any transaction into a spiritual catastrophe. The fear of cursed objects and haunted goods permeated medieval commerce, creating a parallel supernatural economy where spiritual contamination could be bought and sold along with ordinary merchandise. Every object in the medieval marketplace carried the potential for supernatural contamination. Tools, weapons, clothing, jewelry, and even food could become vessels for curses, demonic influence, or spiritual corruption. A beautiful piece of jewelry might carry the curse of its previous owner. A well-made tool could be haunted by the spirit of the craftsman who created it. Even simple household items could become conduits for supernatural malevolence. The concept of spiritual contamination through objects was rooted in the medieval belief that physical items could absorb and retain supernatural energies from their surroundings. Objects that had been present during violent deaths, used in sinful activities, or handled by evil individuals were believed to be permanently contaminated with negative spiritual energy that could affect anyone who subsequently owned or used them. The most feared category of cursed objects was those that had been deliberately enchanted with malevolent intent. Witches and sorcerers were believed to create cursed items specifically designed to bring misfortune, illness, or death to their victims. These objects might appear perfectly normal, but would gradually reveal their supernatural nature through the disasters they brought to their owners. The methods by which objects could become cursed were as varied as they were terrifying. Items used in the commission of crimes, particularly murders, were believed to absorb the spiritual contamination of these evil acts. Objects owned by individuals who died in states of mortal sin were thought to carry their owners' spiritual corruption. Even items that had simply been present during supernatural events could become permanently affected by otherworldly forces. The signs of cursed objects were often subtle and could easily be missed by unsuspecting buyers. Objects that felt unusually cold or hot to the touch were immediately suspect. Items that caused discomfort, pain, or uneasiness when handled might be spiritually contaminated. Objects that seemed to resist normal use, or that broke unexpectedly, could be fighting against their new owner's attempts to use them. But perhaps most terrifying were the cursed objects that revealed their true nature only gradually. A cursed sword might perform perfectly in practice, but fail at crucial moments in battle. A cursed piece of clothing might bring illness to everyone who wore it. A cursed tool might cause accidents or injuries to those who used it. The delayed manifestation of these supernatural effects made it difficult to identify the source of the problems. The marketplace superstitions extended beyond individual cursed objects to include entire categories of goods that were considered spiritually dangerous. Items made from certain materials, crafted during inauspicious times, or created by individuals of questionable moral character, were all viewed with suspicion. The provenance of objects became as important as their quality, with buyers carefully investigating the history of expensive or important purchases. Jewelry was considered particularly susceptible to spiritual contamination because of its intimate contact with the human body and its frequent association with strong emotions. Rings, necklaces, and other personal ornaments could supposedly absorb the spiritual essence of their wearers, making them dangerous to subsequent owners. Engagement and wedding rings were especially feared if the marriages they represented had ended in tragedy or acrimony. Weapons and armor carried their own unique supernatural risks due to their association with violence and death. Swords that had killed many men were believed to develop a supernatural thirst for blood that could influence their wielders to become more violent. Armor that had failed to protect previous owners might carry a curse of vulnerability that would endanger future wearers. The protective measures against cursed objects were elaborate and often expensive. Potential buyers might hire priests or other spiritual experts to examine valuable items before purchase. Objects could be blessed, exorcised, or subjected to purification rituals to remove any supernatural contamination. Some merchants specialized in providing spiritual guarantees for their goods, promising that items had been properly cleansed of any supernatural influences. The authentication of objects' spiritual cleanliness became an important part of medieval commerce. Merchants who dealt in valuable or potentially dangerous items often maintained detailed records of their goods' provenance, including information about previous owners, the circumstances of acquisition, and any known supernatural associations. This spiritual paperwork was as important as documentation of quality or authenticity. The fear of cursed objects created opportunities for both legitimate spiritual services and supernatural fraud. Genuine priests and holy men offered blessings and purification services for objects suspected of spiritual contamination. But unscrupulous individuals also capitalized on these fears, offering fake blessings or claiming to detect curses in perfectly normal objects to extort money from frightened buyers. The intersection of cursed object beliefs with medieval legal systems created complex questions about liability and responsibility. If someone sold a cursed object that subsequently caused harm to its buyer, who was responsible for the resulting damage? Could ignorance of an object's supernatural nature absolve the seller of responsibility? These questions led to legal precedents that recognized spiritual contamination as a legitimate concern in commercial transactions. The psychological impact of cursed object fears on medieval commerce was substantial. Buyers approached major purchases with supernatural anxiety, wondering whether they might be acquiring not just goods, but also spiritual contamination. Sellers lived in fear of unknowingly dealing in cursed merchandise that could destroy their reputations and their businesses. The social consequences of cursed object beliefs extended beyond individual transactions to influence entire communities. Families might be shunned if they were believed to own cursed objects that could contaminate their neighbors. Merchants who dealt in spiritually dangerous goods could find themselves ostracized by their communities. The fear of supernatural contamination created social divisions that went beyond simple economic relationships. The seasonal and temporal aspects of cursed object beliefs added additional layers of complexity to medieval commerce. Certain times of year were considered more dangerous for acquiring new objects, particularly during periods when supernatural activity was believed to be at its peak. The phases of the moon, religious holidays, and other significant dates could all influence the spiritual safety of commercial transactions. The international aspects of medieval trade created additional concerns about cursed objects from foreign lands. Items imported from distant countries were viewed with particular suspicion, as they might carry unfamiliar curses or be contaminated with foreign supernatural influences. The exotic nature of imported goods made them more desirable, but also more spiritually dangerous. The apprenticeship and training of medieval merchants included education about the supernatural aspects of commerce. Young traders learned to recognize the signs of cursed objects, to perform basic protective rituals, and to maintain proper spiritual hygiene in their business dealings. This supernatural education was considered as important as knowledge of market conditions and product quality. Chapter 12: The Curse of the Crossroads and Supernatural Geography. In the medieval landscape, where ancient Roman roads intersected with newer pathways and forest tracks converged in isolated clearings, certain locations held a special terror in the minds of medieval Europeans. Crossroads were not simply places where travelers chose their direction. They were supernatural nexuses where the boundaries between worlds grew thin and otherworldly forces gathered to influence human destiny. The crossroads represented one of the most potent supernatural locations in medieval European belief, a place where the normal rules of reality were suspended and anything might happen. These intersections of pathways were believed to be gathering places for demons, witches, fairies, and other supernatural entities who used them as meeting grounds for their otherworldly activities. The supernatural significance of crossroads was rooted in their liminal nature as places of transition and choice. Medieval people understood that crossroads represented moments of decision where travelers had to choose their path, making them symbolically powerful locations where fate itself might be altered. This association with choice and change made crossroads natural gathering places for supernatural forces that sought to influence human destiny. The most terrifying aspect of crossroads superstitions was the belief that these locations were neutral ground where humans could encounter supernatural entities on relatively equal terms. Unlike other supernatural encounters where humans were helpless victims, crossroads meetings involved negotiations, bargains, and exchanges that could theoretically benefit both parties. But these supernatural transactions came with enormous risks and usually terrible prices. The most famous of these supernatural crossroads encounters was the making of pacts with the devil himself. According to medieval belief, desperate individuals could meet Satan at crossroads during certain times and under specific conditions to negotiate deals for their souls. These diabolic bargains typically involve the human receiving supernatural powers, knowledge, or worldly success in exchange for their eternal damnation. The process of summoning the devil at crossroads was both terrifying and precise. The supplicant had to arrive at a crossroads at exactly midnight, carrying specific objects and performing particular rituals. They might need to bury personal items at the center of the intersection, recite blasphemous incantations, or perform acts of deliberate sacrilege to attract diabolic attention. The appearance of the devil at crossroads was described in various forms, but always designed to maximize both temptation and terror. Sometimes he appeared as a well-dressed gentleman who spoke eloquently and promised everything the summoner desired. Other times, he manifested as a terrifying demon with horns, fangs, and burning eyes. In some accounts, he took the form of a large black dog, cat, or other animal that could speak with a human voice. The negotiations with supernatural entities at crossroads were fraught with danger because of the complexity of supernatural law and the devil's reputation for deceptive contracts. Humans who attempted to bargain with supernatural beings often found themselves trapped by the precise wording of their agreements. The devil was believed to be a master of legal technicalities who could twist any contract to his advantage. But crossroads were not only associated with diabolic bargains. They were also believed to be locations where witches gathered for their Sabbaths, where fairies held their courts, and where ghosts and spirits congregated. The supernatural activity at crossroads was so intense that many people avoided these locations entirely, particularly after dark or during times when supernatural activity was believed to be at its peak. The timing of crossroads encounters was crucial to their supernatural significance. Midnight was the most dangerous time, as it represented the boundary between one day and the next, and was believed to be when supernatural forces were most active. Certain nights of the year, particularly Halloween, Walpurgis Night, and the solstices, were considered especially perilous for crossroads travel. The physical characteristics of different crossroads influenced their supernatural potency. Intersections of four roads were considered more powerful than simple three-way junctions. Crossroads located in isolated areas, particularly those surrounded by forests or positioned on hills, were believed to be more attractive to supernatural entities. Ancient crossroads with a long history of human use were thought to have accumulated supernatural energy over time. The burial of executed criminals at crossroads was a widespread medieval practice that added to their supernatural terror. Suicides, murderers, and other malefactors were often interred at crossroads to prevent their restless spirits from finding their way back to populated areas. The multiple paths leading away from crossroads were believed to confuse the spirits of the dead, keeping them trapped and unable to return to haunt the living. But this practice of burying the damned at crossroads also made these locations even more supernaturally dangerous. The concentration of restless spirits, combined with the natural supernatural activity of crossroads, created locations of intense otherworldly energy. Travelers passing through such crossroads might encounter not just demons and fairies, but also the vengeful ghosts of executed criminals. The protective measures for crossroads travel were elaborate and varied by region and tradition. Travelers might carry iron objects, religious symbols, or blessed items to ward off supernatural encounters. Some traditions involved making specific signs or gestures when approaching crossroads to show respect to any supernatural entities present. Others required the recitation of prayers or protective charms. The practice of leaving offerings at crossroads was common throughout medieval Europe. These might include food, coins, flowers, or other tokens intended to appease any supernatural entities present and ensure safe passage. The failure to leave appropriate offerings could result in supernatural harassment, misdirection, or worse consequences for the disrespectful traveler. The supernatural geography of crossroads extended beyond the immediate intersection to include the roads that led to and from these locations. Paths that led to crossroads were considered spiritually charged, with supernatural activity increasing as travelers approached the intersection. The direction from which one approached a crossroads could influence the type of supernatural encounter experienced there. The seasonal changes at crossroads were believed to affect their supernatural properties. Spring crossroads might be dominated by fairy activity as nature spirits celebrated the renewal of life. Summer intersections could be gathering places for sun-worshipping entities and nature demons. Autumn crossroads were associated with death spirits and harvest-related supernatural beings. Winter intersections were considered most dangerous, as they attracted entities seeking warmth and life force from living travelers. The social impact of crossroads superstitions on medieval communities was substantial. Important crossroads often became the sites of churches, shrines, or other religious structures intended to sanctify these spiritually dangerous locations. Markets and fairs were sometimes held at crossroads, taking advantage of their accessibility while attempting to counter their supernatural associations with human activity and divine blessing. The intersection of crossroads beliefs with medieval law and governance created interesting complications. Legal proceedings sometimes took place at crossroads, taking advantage of their symbolism as places of decision and judgment. But the supernatural associations of these locations also made them problematic venues for official business, as participants might fear supernatural interference in legal proceedings. The psychological impact of crossroads superstitions on medieval travelers cannot be overstated. Every journey that involved passing through crossroads became a supernatural adventure filled with potential encounters with otherworldly entities. The simple act of choosing which road to take became fraught with spiritual significance, as travelers wondered whether their decisions were being influenced by supernatural forces. The crossroads served as powerful metaphors for the spiritual choices that medieval people faced in their daily lives. The decision between good and evil, salvation and damnation, was often visualized as a crossroads where individuals had to choose their path. This metaphorical usage reinforced the supernatural associations of actual crossroads and made them even more psychologically powerful. Chapter 13: The Supernatural Feast, Food, Drink, and Otherworldly Consumption. In the medieval world, where hunger was a constant companion and famine could devastate entire regions, food held a significance that went far beyond mere sustenance. Every meal was a potential supernatural encounter, every bite a possible communion with otherworldly forces. The act of eating and drinking was surrounded by beliefs so terrifying that they could transform the simple pleasure of a shared meal into a nightmare of supernatural terror. The medieval understanding of food was fundamentally spiritual. What a person consumed was believed to affect not just their physical health, but their spiritual state and their vulnerability to supernatural influence. Food could be blessed or cursed, pure or contaminated, life-giving or deadly in ways that had nothing to do with its nutritional value or physical condition. The most terrifying aspect of food-related superstitions was the belief that consumption could result in spiritual possession or transformation. Eating food that had been cursed, contaminated by supernatural forces, or prepared with malevolent intent could allow demons, evil spirits, or other malevolent entities to enter the body through the act of consumption. Once inside, these supernatural parasites could control their host's behavior, corrupt their soul, or consume their life force from within. The preparation of food was surrounded by protective rituals designed to prevent supernatural contamination. Meals were blessed before consumption to ensure divine protection against evil influences. Salt, believed to have powerful purifying properties, was added to food not just for flavor, but as a spiritual safeguard. The timing of food preparation was carefully considered, with certain times of day or year considered more dangerous for cooking and eating. But even these protective measures could be overcome by sufficiently powerful supernatural influences. Witches were believed to have the ability to curse food through supernatural means, contaminating meals that appeared perfectly normal to unsuspecting victims. The effects of such cursed food might not manifest immediately, allowing the supernatural contamination to work slowly and subtly over time. The concept of supernatural hunger was particularly terrifying, involving entities that fed not on physical food, but on human life force, emotions, or spiritual energy. Vampires, demons, and other supernatural parasites were believed to sustain themselves by consuming aspects of humanity that could not be physically seen or measured. These supernatural predators might appear to eat normal food, but were actually feeding on their victims' souls. The communal aspects of medieval dining created additional opportunities for supernatural terror. Shared meals could become vectors for supernatural contamination, with a single cursed dish affecting multiple victims simultaneously. The act of breaking bread together, which was supposed to create bonds of fellowship and trust, could instead become a means of spreading supernatural corruption throughout entire communities. The beliefs surrounding supernatural food extended to include specific ingredients that were considered spiritually dangerous or beneficial. Certain herbs, spices, and other substances were believed to have powerful supernatural properties that could affect the spiritual state of those who consumed them. Garlic was famous for its supposed ability to repel vampires and other supernatural entities, while other plants were believed to attract otherworldly attention or provide supernatural protection. The seasonal aspects of supernatural food beliefs were tied to the agricultural calendar and the availability of different ingredients throughout the year. Foods harvested during certain times were considered more spiritually potent, while others gathered during inauspicious periods might be contaminated with supernatural influences. The first fruits of the harvest were often subjected to special blessing rituals to ensure their spiritual purity. The intersection of supernatural food beliefs with religious practices created additional layers of complexity. Fasting was not just a form of spiritual discipline, but also a protective measure against supernatural contamination. By abstaining from food during dangerous periods, individuals could reduce their vulnerability to supernatural attack through consumption. Religious feast days involved special foods that were believed to provide spiritual protection and divine blessing. The preparation and consumption of food by suspected supernatural entities was a source of particular fascination and terror. Witches were believed to prepare their own food using ingredients that would be poisonous or disgusting to normal humans. They supposedly consumed raw meat, blood, and other substances that revealed their supernatural nature. The ability to eat normally was sometimes used as a test to determine whether someone was truly human or a supernatural imposter. The concept of supernatural banquets was among the most terrifying food-related beliefs. These were elaborate feasts supposedly prepared by supernatural entities to tempt, trap, or corrupt human victims. Fairy banquets might appear to offer the most delicious foods imaginable, but consumption would trap the victim in the supernatural realm or transform them into supernatural beings themselves. The preservation and storage of food was also surrounded by supernatural beliefs. Food that spoiled or rotted unusually quickly might be under supernatural attack. Conversely, Food that remained fresh far longer than expected could be supernaturally preserved, possibly by malevolent forces for their own purposes. The proper spiritual protection of food stores was considered as important as physical measures against spoilage and pests. The sharing of food with strangers was fraught with supernatural danger, as these unknown individuals might be supernatural entities in disguise. Traditional hospitality customs required offering food to travelers and guests. But these same customs could be exploited by supernatural beings seeking to gain entry to human homes and communities. The careful observation of how visitors consumed offered food became a way to detect potential supernatural threats. The medicinal aspects of food were closely tied to supernatural beliefs about consumption and spiritual health. Certain foods were believed to provide protection against supernatural attack, while others might increase vulnerability to otherworldly influences. The preparation of medicinal foods often involved complex rituals designed to enhance their supernatural protective properties while preventing their contamination by malevolent forces. The psychological impact of supernatural food beliefs on medieval communities was profound. Every meal became an act of faith, requiring trust in the spiritual purity of the food and the good intentions of those who prepared it. The simple pleasures of eating and drinking were complicated by constant awareness of supernatural risks and the need for protective measures. The social consequences of food-related supernatural beliefs extended to influence medieval concepts of hospitality, community, and trust. Sharing food was not just a social custom, but a spiritual act that created bonds and obligations between participants. The contamination of communal food could destroy relationships and tear apart communities, while the proper blessing and sharing of meals could strengthen social bonds and provide collective protection against supernatural threats. Chapter 14. The Nightmare Realm: Sleep, Dreams, and Nocturnal Terrors. When darkness fell across medieval Europe and weary villagers retired to their beds of straw and rough wool, they entered not a realm of peaceful rest, but a supernatural battleground, where their souls were vulnerable to attack by otherworldly forces. Sleep, which should have been a refuge from the trials of daily life, became instead a time of terrifying vulnerability when demons could invade dreams, spirits could steal souls, and the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead became dangerously thin. The medieval understanding of sleep was fundamentally supernatural. The state of unconsciousness was believed to temporarily separate the soul from the body, allowing the spirit to travel to otherworldly realms while leaving the physical form defensively helpless. This spiritual separation made sleeping individuals particularly vulnerable to supernatural attack, possession, and soul theft. The most feared nocturnal threat was the incubus and succubus, demonic entities that were believed to visit sleeping humans for supernatural seduction and spiritual corruption. These demons would appear in dreams as impossibly attractive lovers, tempting their victims into acts of spiritual adultery that could damn their souls and drain their life force. The experience was said to be simultaneously terrifying and irresistibly pleasurable, leaving victims confused about whether they had been attacked or seduced. The physical effects of incubus and succubus encounters were believed to manifest in the waking world as exhaustion, illness, and spiritual corruption. Victims would wake feeling drained and weak, as if their life force had been consumed during the night. Repeated encounters could lead to madness, death, or complete spiritual corruption. Pregnant women were particularly vulnerable, as these demons could supposedly impregnate human females with supernatural offspring. The phenomenon of sleep paralysis, which modern medicine understands as a temporary inability to move upon waking, was interpreted by medieval minds as evidence of supernatural attack. Victims who experienced this terrifying condition believed they were being held down by demons, ghosts, or other malevolent entities. The feeling of pressure on the chest and difficulty breathing were seen as signs that supernatural beings were attempting to steal the victim's soul or life force. The old hag, known by various names across different European cultures, was perhaps the most universally feared nocturnal supernatural entity. This malevolent spirit was believed to sit on the chests of sleeping victims, causing nightmares, breathing difficulties, and a sensation of being crushed or suffocated. The old hag was often described as an ancient, hideous woman with long fingernails and glowing eyes who fed on human fear and suffering. Dreams themselves were understood not as random neurological activity, but as supernatural communications or spiritual journeys. Nightmares were believed to be actual visits from demons or evil spirits attempting to corrupt or terrorize the dreamer. Prophetic dreams might be messages from angels, saints, or deceased relatives trying to communicate important information to the living. The interpretation of dreams was considered a serious spiritual practice that could reveal hidden truths about the supernatural world. The timing of nocturnal supernatural activity was believed to follow specific patterns that made certain hours more dangerous than others. The period between midnight and 3 in the morning was considered particularly perilous, as this was when the boundary between worlds was thinnest and supernatural entities were most active. The hour of 3 in the morning was especially feared as a mocking inversion of the 3 o'clock hour when Christ was believed to have died. The protective measures against nocturnal supernatural attacks were elaborate and varied by region and tradition. Beds were positioned away from windows and doors to prevent supernatural entities from easily approaching sleeping victims. Iron objects, particularly iron nails or horseshoes, were placed under beds or hung from bedposts to repel demonic visitors. Religious symbols, including crucifixes and sacred images, were displayed prominently in sleeping areas. The practice of bedtime prayers was not just spiritual preparation for sleep, but active supernatural defense. Specific prayers were believed to provide divine protection against nocturnal demons and evil spirits. The recitation of protective psalms or religious verses could supposedly create spiritual barriers that malevolent entities could not cross. Some traditions required prayers to be repeated throughout the night whenever the sleeper awakened. The phenomenon of nightmare epidemics could sweep through medieval communities, with multiple individuals simultaneously reporting terrifying dreams and nocturnal supernatural encounters. These communal outbreaks of supernatural terror were often attributed to demonic attacks on entire villages or regions. The psychological contagion of nightmare reports could create mass hysteria that disrupted entire communities for weeks or months. The superstitions surrounding children's sleep were particularly elaborate and fearful. Young people were considered especially vulnerable to supernatural attack because of their spiritual innocence and the incomplete development of their soul's defenses. Elaborate protective rituals surrounded children's bedtime routines, including special prayers, blessed objects, and specific positioning of cribs and beds to maximize supernatural protection. The concept of soul travel during sleep was both fascinating and terrifying to medieval minds. Some individuals were believed to possess the ability to project their souls from their bodies during sleep, allowing them to travel great distances and gather information from remote locations. But this spiritual gift was also dangerous, as the traveling soul might encounter supernatural entities or become lost and unable to return to its physical body. The interpretation of sleep disturbances was a complex supernatural science involving the analysis of physical symptoms, dream content, and environmental factors. Restless sleep might indicate supernatural harassment, while unusually deep sleep could suggest soul theft or demonic possession. The position in which someone was found sleeping, their facial expressions, and any sounds they made during the night were all considered important diagnostic information. The social consequences of nocturnal supernatural beliefs extended beyond individual fear to influence family relationships and community structures. Spouses monitored each other for signs of supernatural attack during sleep. Parents maintained vigilant watch over their children's nocturnal safety. Communities developed shared protocols for responding to supernatural sleep disturbances and protecting vulnerable individuals. The intersection of sleep superstitions with medieval medicine created additional layers of supernatural interpretation for natural sleep disorders. Conditions like sleep apnea, narcolepsy, and night terrors were understood entirely through supernatural frameworks. Medical treatments for sleep problems often focused on spiritual remedies rather than physical interventions, including exorcisms, blessings, and supernatural protective measures. The psychological impact of nocturnal supernatural beliefs on medieval sleep patterns was profound and lasting. Many individuals developed chronic insomnia due to fear of supernatural attack during sleep. Others became so anxious about potential nocturnal encounters that they avoided sleep altogether during dangerous periods. The quality of rest suffered as people remained partially alert even while sleeping, listening for signs of supernatural activity. The seasonal variations in nocturnal supernatural activity were carefully tracked and feared by medieval communities. Winter nights, with their extended darkness, were considered particularly dangerous. Certain times of year, including the period between Christmas and Epiphany, were believed to see increased supernatural activity that made sleep especially risky. The phases of the moon were also thought to influence the intensity of nocturnal supernatural threats. Chapter 15: The Final Darkness, Death Omens, and Supernatural Harbingers. In medieval Europe, death was never a surprise visitor that arrived without warning. Instead, it announced its approach through a terrifying array of supernatural omens, ghostly harbingers, and otherworldly signs that filled the final days and hours of life with supernatural dread. These death portents were not merely superstitious folklore, but genuine sources of terror that could transform the natural process of dying into a supernatural nightmare of prophecy and otherworldly intervention. The medieval mind understood death not as a simple biological event, but as a cosmic transition that affected the entire supernatural landscape. The approach of death was believed to thin the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, allowing supernatural entities to cross over and interact with the dying person and their loved ones. This made the deathbed not just a place of medical care, but a supernatural battleground where good and evil forces competed for the departing soul. The most universally feared death omen was the appearance of the banshee, a supernatural entity that announced impending death through her terrifying wails and lamentations. The banshee was typically described as a ghostly woman with long flowing hair and a voice that could freeze the blood of those who heard it. Her appearance near a household was an infallible sign that someone within would die within days or hours. The banshee's cry was said to be unlike any earthly sound, a supernatural keening that combined grief, warning, and otherworldly terror in a voice that could carry for miles through the night air. Those who heard the banshee's wail would know with terrible certainty that death was approaching, but they would not know who among their loved ones was marked for the grave. This created a period of agonizing suspense as families waited to see which member would be claimed by the supernatural herald. The appearance of spectral animals was another category of death omens that struck terror into medieval hearts. Black dogs, with glowing red eyes, were among the most feared supernatural harbingers, appearing to those who were about to die or to their family members as warnings of approaching doom. These phantom hounds were often described as being larger than normal dogs, with an otherworldly presence that made them immediately recognizable as supernatural entities. Ravens, crows, and other carrion birds were also considered powerful death omens when they appeared in unusual numbers or behaved in strange ways. A raven that perched on someone's roof and refused to leave was seen as a clear sign that death was coming to that household. Birds that flew into houses or appeared at windows were interpreted as supernatural messengers, bringing news of impending doom from the other world. The phenomenon of death knocks was perhaps the most psychologically terrifying category of supernatural death omens. These were unexplained sounds, usually described as 3 measured knocks, that would be heard at doors, windows, or walls when no living person was present to make them. The timing and pattern of these supernatural sounds were believed to indicate not just that someone would die, but when the death would occur. The appearance of doppelgangers or spiritual doubles was considered one of the most reliable and terrifying death omens. When someone saw their own exact duplicate, it was understood as a sign that their soul was preparing to separate from their body and that death was imminent. These ghostly doubles might appear in mirrors, be seen by other people, or manifest as shadows that moved independently of their owners. The behavior of domestic animals was carefully monitored for signs of supernatural awareness of approaching death. Dogs that howled without apparent cause, cats that stared fixedly at empty spaces, and horses that refused to enter certain areas were all considered sensitive to supernatural presences that indicated approaching death. The ability of animals to detect supernatural activity made them involuntary prophets of doom whose behavior was watched with fearful attention. The timing of death omens was believed to follow specific patterns that could provide information about when the predicted death would occur. Omens that appeared during certain hours of the day or night were thought to indicate the timing of the approaching death. Supernatural signs that manifested during specific phases of the moon or on particular calendar dates were interpreted as precise prophecies that allowed families to prepare for the inevitable. The personal nature of many death omens made them particularly terrifying for individual families. Unlike general supernatural threats that affected entire communities, death omens were specific predictions that targeted particular households or individuals. This created an intimate relationship between the living and the supernatural forces that controlled death, making every unusual occurrence a potential harbinger of personal doom. The protective measures against death omens were limited and often considered futile, as these supernatural signs were understood to be prophecies rather than threats that could be avoided. However, some traditions held that proper spiritual preparation could ease the dying process or ensure the soul's safe passage to the afterlife. This included confession, last rites, and the gathering of family members to provide spiritual support during the transition. The interpretation of death omens required specialized knowledge that was often possessed by elderly community members, wise women, or religious authorities. The ability to read supernatural signs correctly was considered both a valuable skill and a terrible burden, as those who possessed this knowledge often found themselves delivering news of approaching death to terrified families. The psychological impact of death omens on medieval communities cannot be overstated. The constant awareness that supernatural forces were monitoring human mortality and announcing approaching deaths created a climate of perpetual anxiety. Every unusual sound, every strange animal behavior, every unexplained phenomenon could potentially be a death omen that would transform a normal day into a period of terrified waiting. The social consequences of death omen beliefs extended beyond individual families to affect entire communities. The appearance of omens that predicted multiple deaths or community-wide disasters could create mass panic and social disruption. Economic activity might cease as people focused on spiritual preparation rather than worldly concerns. Normal social relationships could be strained as people became reluctant to interact with those who had been marked by death omens. The intersection of death omen beliefs with medieval medicine created complex relationships between supernatural prophecy and medical care. Physicians and healers had to work within a framework where the appearance of death omens might be considered more reliable indicators of prognosis than physical symptoms. This could lead to the abandonment of medical treatment when supernatural signs suggested that death was inevitable. The religious implications of death omens were complicated and often controversial. While some church authorities embraced these supernatural signs as evidence of divine providence and the interconnection of the physical and spiritual worlds, others condemned them as superstitious beliefs that distracted from proper Christian preparation for death. This tension created confusion and anxiety for medieval people who were trying to navigate between official religious doctrine and popular supernatural beliefs. The seasonal variations in death omen activity were carefully observed and recorded by medieval communities. Certain times of year were considered more active for supernatural harbingers, particularly the winter months when death rates naturally increased due to disease and harsh weather conditions. The period between Christmas and Epiphany was especially feared as a time when the supernatural world was most active and death omens were most likely to appear. And so we come to the end of our journey through the most terrifying superstitions of medieval Europe, but the shadows they cast extend far beyond those dark centuries. These weren't just quaint beliefs held by ignorant people in a backward time. They were genuine expressions of human fear, attempts to understand and control forces that seemed beyond comprehension or influence. What makes these medieval superstitions so enduringly terrifying is how they tapped into fundamental human anxieties that persist even today. The fear of the unknown, the terror of death, the anxiety about supernatural forces beyond our control, the worry that those closest to us might not be who they seem. These are timeless human concerns that transcend any particular historical period. The medieval world was a place where every shadow might hide a demon, every stranger could be a supernatural threat, and every misfortune might be the result of otherworldly malevolence. It was a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous and constantly shifting, where the forces of good and evil were locked in eternal combat, and where ordinary people found themselves caught in the crossfire of cosmic conflicts beyond their understanding. But perhaps most terrifying of all, these beliefs shaped reality through their power to influence human behavior. Innocent people died because they were suspected of supernatural evil. Families were destroyed by fears of changelings and cursed objects. Communities tore themselves apart in searches for supernatural enemies. The superstitions themselves became supernatural forces that wreaked havoc on the medieval world. As you turn off the lights tonight and settle into your modern bed with its clean sheets and comfortable mattress, surrounded by the safety of electric lighting and scientific understanding, remember the medieval villagers who faced each night with genuine terror. They believed that darkness brought not just the absence of light, but the presence of supernatural evil. They understood that safety was never guaranteed, and that the forces of otherworldly malevolence were always waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the medieval world, there was no such thing as just a superstition. There were only beliefs powerful enough to change the world, for better or for worse. And somewhere, in the deepest shadows of the night, those ancient fears still whisper their warnings to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. The medieval age may be long past, but its supernatural terrors live on in every unexplained sound, every shadow that moves without cause, and every moment when we wonder if we are truly alone in the darkness. Because sometimes late at night, when the modern world grows quiet and the ancient fears stir in our deepest memories, we might just hear the echo of those terrifying superstitions calling to us across the centuries, reminding us that some things are too dark and too dangerous to ever truly die. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the supernatural nightmare that was medieval Europe. Until next time, keep the lights on, and remember, in a world where anything could be supernatural, everything was terrifying.